Chapter 1. An Unexpected Encounter. The cold, sterile air of the space station bit into Relira's skin as she dashed through its narrow corridors. Her heart pounded in her chest, every step a reminder that she was being hunted. They were closing in, and she could feel the vibrations of their footsteps reverberating through the station's metallic floor. Her pursuers weren't typical bounty hunters, they were the merciless syndicates from Dranik 4, infamous for hunting down runaway aliens for sport. And she was their prize. She stumbled, her three-toed foot catching on the edge of a bulkhead door. Pain shot through her leg, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not here, not now. She winced and forced herself to move faster, her lavender skin glistening with sweat as her elongated ears twitched, listening for the slightest hint of movement. Relira was no warrior. She was a refugee, a scholar from a peaceful planet that had long been decimated by war. Her kind were scattered across the galaxy, trying to survive in the shadows. Rounding a corner, she spotted a small alcove tucked behind a support pillar. Desperate, she ducked into it, pressing her back against the cold wall, her breath shallow and fast. She was hidden, for now, but how long before they found her? The syndicates had tracking technology that could pick up the faintest heat signatures, and her body temperature had already spiked from fear and exertion. As she tried to steady her breathing, Relira couldn't help but recall the stories she'd heard about this particular section of the galaxy stories of the bloodthirsty humans. These weren't just myths told to frighten young alien children. No, the humans of the Outer Rim were notorious for their cruelty. They were ruthless warriors, remnants of a bygone age when Earth had been destroyed in an apocalyptic war, leaving only the most savage survivors to roam the stars. She had always avoided human territory, but now, in her desperation to flee, she had stumbled into the last place she wanted to be. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps reached her ears. The syndicates had found her trail. Relira's heart raced, her muscles tense as she prepared for the inevitable. But something else caught her attention, another sound, quieter, but closer. She wasn't alone in this alcove. Her large, amber eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and she made out the outline of a figure standing mere feet away. A human. His form was massive, towering over her even in the shadows. His body was covered in strange armor, not the sleek, advanced suits most species wore, but something rough and battle-worn. The edges of his gear were jagged, and there was a dark stain that covered part of his chest plate, one that Relira instinctively knew wasn't just oil or dirt. This was a killer, a bloodthirsty human. Her breath caught in her throat, and she fought the urge to scream. If the syndicates didn't kill her, this human surely would. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen in place. She could barely hear anything over the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. The human, for his part, didn't move. He simply stood there, watching her, his face obscured by the helmet he wore. His silence was unnerving, and she wondered if he was merely toying with her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A cold bead of sweat ran down her neck as she braced for the worst. Suddenly, a voice broke the tense silence. "They're coming for you." The voice was deep, gravelly, and distinctly human. It wasn't what she expected. There was no malice, no sadistic glee, just a statement of fact. Relira blinked, confused. Why wasn't he attacking? Was this some cruel human mind game? Was he going to hand her over to the syndicates in exchange for a bounty? Before she could form a coherent response, the human shifted, moving toward her with surprising speed. She flinched, expecting to feel the cold bite of a blade or the crushing force of his fist. But instead, he grabbed her arm and pulled her deeper into the alcove, pressing her against the wall. "Stay quiet," he ordered in that same low tone. Her mind raced, but she obeyed, too stunned to resist. As they stood together in the darkness, she heard the heavy footsteps of the syndicates pass by, their guttural voices cursing in frustration. They were close, too close, but for some reason, they hadn't noticed them. Relira's breath hitched as she realized the human had activated some kind of cloaking field, one that masked their heat signatures. How could someone so brutish possess such advanced technology? Minutes passed like hours, but eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance. Relira let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The human released her and stepped back, his towering form still blocking the entrance to the alcove. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Why had he helped her? He was human, a species she had been raised to fear and avoid at all costs. And yet, he had just saved her life. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you? He didn't answer at first. Instead, he removed his helmet, revealing a rugged face marked with scars. His eyes were piercing, a sharp contrast to the cold demeanor he projected. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Not all humans are monsters, he said simply. Before she could ask more, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the station. The syndicates were still hunting, and they were running out of time. We need to move, the human said, turning his back to her and stepping out of the alcove. If you want to survive, follow me. Relira hesitated, torn between the fear that had been ingrained in her and the strange sense of safety this human had just provided. But with no other choice, she followed him into the unknown, her mind buzzing with questions and the weight of her own disbelief. Chapter 2. Through the Gauntlet. Relira kept her distance, following the human cautiously as they weaved through the labyrinth of corridors. The station was enormous, a relic from some long-forgotten era, and its decaying infrastructure groaned under the weight of its age. Every once in a while, she would catch a glimpse of her human savior, his broad shoulders cutting through the darkness like a ship through the void. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this place, and yet there was a strange intensity in his steps, like he was trying to reach somewhere before it was too late. Where are we going? Relira finally dared to ask, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of the station's failing systems. The human didn't slow his pace as he responded. To a shuttle bay. There's a ship we can use to get out of here. He had said. The notion struck her as odd. Why was he helping her? The stories she had heard about humans painted them as solitary creatures, violent and mistrustful of other species. They thrived on chaos and destruction, always looking out for themselves first. But this man seemed different, calculating, yes, but not cruel. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but for now, she had no choice. After a few more turns through the station's winding corridors, they reached a large door that led to the shuttle bay. The human raised a hand, gesturing for her to stop. She froze in place, watching as he crouched low and peered around the corner, scanning the area ahead. They're waiting for us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Relira's heart sank. The syndicates must have predicted their route and laid an ambush. Her pulse quickened, the familiar panic rising within her. She had no weapon, no training for this kind of combat. All she could do was stand there, helpless and vulnerable. The human, however, didn't seem fazed. He turned back to her, his expression calm yet serious. Stay behind me, he said firmly, reaching for a weapon strapped to his back, a strange, bulky rifle that seemed to have been cobbled together from various parts. She had seen such crude weapons before, but in his hands, it seemed anything but ineffective. When I give the signal, run to the shuttle. Relira stared at him, confusion and fear swirling in her chest. You're going to take them all on by yourself? He gave her a sideways glance, and for the first time, she saw the faintest hint of a smirk on his face. I've handled worse. Before she could protest, he was already in motion. With a swift, almost predatory grace, he stepped into the open bay, his weapon raised and ready. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the air heavy with tension. And then all hell broke loose. The human fired the first shot, a deafening crack that echoed through the bay. His aim was precise, his shots calculated. Syndicates who had been lying in wait were caught off guard, scrambling for cover as his barrage of fire tore through their ranks. Relira could hardly believe her eyes. The stories about humans being bloodthirsty might have been exaggerated, but their skill in combat was no myth. This man moved like a predator, his movements fluid and lethal. But what struck her the most was his restraint. He didn't kill recklessly. Every shot was deliberate, disabling rather than executing. He was giving her the chance to escape, not leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. It didn't fit the image she had of humans. He fought with purpose, not bloodlust. Go! His voice cut through her thoughts. Relira snapped out of her daze, her feet moving before she fully processed his command. She darted toward the shuttle at the far end of the bay, her heart pounding in her ears. As she ran, She glanced back to see the human holding off several more syndicates, his movements sharp and efficient, like a machine. Her breath hitched as she reached the shuttle's ramp, nearly stumbling as she scrambled inside. The controls were old, but she recognized the layout and ancient model, but one that was still functional. She fumbled with the interface, her fingers shaking as she activated the engines. The human was still fighting, buying her the time she needed. But there were too many of them. She could see more syndicates pouring into the bay from other entrances, and despite his skill, even he couldn't hold them off forever. Rhalyra's chest tightened. If she took off now, she could escape. But she would be leaving him behind. He had saved her life. Without him, she would have been captured, or worse. She made a split-second decision, her hands flying across the controls. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and the ramp began to close. But instead of taking off, she swung the shuttle around, positioning it directly in front of the human and the advancing syndicates. The sudden presence of the shuttle drew the attention of the attackers, and for a moment, they hesitated. Rhalyra seized the opportunity, engaging the shuttle's forward-mounted weapons. Laser fire erupted from the ship, creating a wall of suppression that forced the syndicates to scatter. "Get in!" she shouted through the shuttle's comm system, her voice strained with urgency. The human didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the shuttle, diving into the closing ramp just as the syndicates regrouped and returned fire. The ramp sealed behind him, and Rhalyra wasted no time, punching the throttle and sending the shuttle hurtling toward the exit. As the ship cleared the station and rocketed into the vacuum of space, Rhalyra finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were trembling, her mind racing from the adrenaline of the escape. She couldn't believe what she had just done. She had risked everything to save a human, one of the very beings she had been taught to fear. In the back of the shuttle, the human stood up, brushing off the dust from his armor. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why did you turn back?" he asked, his tone calm, though there was an edge of curiosity in his voice. Rhalyra met his gaze, her amber eyes filled with confusion. "You saved my life. I couldn't just leave you behind." For a long moment, they stared at each other, two beings from different worlds, brought together by circumstance. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the human gave a small nod, a flicker of something respect, perhaps crossing his face. Good to know there's still some decency left in the galaxy. Rhalyra's chest tightened at his words. She had always believed that humans were monsters, but now, for the first time, she saw them differently. This human, at least, was something more. Something she didn't yet understand. Chapter 3. Trust is earned. The shuttle glided through space, the cold expanse stretching endlessly around them. Rhalyra sat in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls, though the immediate danger had passed. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions she couldn't begin to answer. She glanced back at the human, who was now sitting on one of the shuttle's benches, cleaning his weapon with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown in battle. His helmet sat beside him, revealing the rugged features that seemed to carry a lifetime of experience. Scars marred his skin, especially across his hands and forearms. They told a story of survival, of violence, and yet there was a calmness in his movements that seemed at odds with the brutality she had witnessed. Rhalyra cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "You never told me your name." The human didn't look up from his work at first, but after a moment, he paused and glanced her way. "Jackson," he said simply, returning to his task. "Jackson," she repeated, trying to familiarize herself with the sound. It was a simple, human name, one that didn't fit the image of the terrifying killers from the stories she'd heard. She had expected something harsher, something more fitting of a so-called bloodthirsty human. "And you?" Jackson asked, his voice low but not unkind. "Rhalyra," she said, her voice softer now that the tension had eased somewhat. Jackson gave a short nod of acknowledgement. "Nice to meet you, Rhalyra." They fell into silence again, the hum of the shuttle's engines the only sound between them. Rhalyra found herself stealing glances at him, trying to make sense of the man who had just saved her life. The stories about humans didn't add up, not with what she was seeing. He was dangerous, that much was clear, but he didn't seem bloodthirsty. He had fought to protect her, not for the thrill of it. He had disabled enemies instead of killing them outright. There was a method to his violence, a code of some kind. Finally, Her curiosity got the better of her. "Why did you help me?" Jackson set his weapon aside, leaning back slightly against the wall of the shuttle. He met her gaze, his eyes steady and piercing. "Why not?" Relira frowned, shaking her head. "That's not an answer. You had no reason to. I'm not one of your kind. My people were taught to fear humans." Jackson sighed, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "You've probably heard a lot of stories about us. Some of them are true, most of them aren't. But I didn't help you because of who you are. I helped because it was the right thing to do." "The right thing to do?" Relira echoed, her confusion deepening. "But you didn't know me. For all you knew, I could have been dangerous." Jackson shrugged. "Maybe, but I've seen enough in this galaxy to know that not every fight is about survival. Sometimes you help because no one else will." Relira fell silent, absorbing his words. There was something deeper here, a complexity to this human that she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a warrior. He was someone who had clearly lived through unimaginable hardships, and yet he still carried a sense of morality, a code of honor that seemed at odds with the reputation his people had. "Is that why you're out here?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Helping people?" Jackson's jaw tightened for a moment, and he glanced away, staring out into the dark void of space beyond the shuttle's cockpit. "Not exactly. I'm out here because it's the only place I belong anymore." Relira sensed a weight behind his words, a pain that he wasn't willing to share. She didn't press further, knowing that trust wasn't something that could be forced. Instead, she focused on the more immediate concern. "Where are we going?" she asked, steering the conversation towards something practical. Jackson leaned forward, pulling up a small holographic map on the console. "We're heading to a neutral spaceport a few light years from here. It's a safe place to lay low for a while. You can catch a transport there and figure out your next move." Relira studied the map, noting the small station orbiting a dead planet. It wasn't an ideal location, but it was better than being hunted by syndicates. She nodded slowly, processing the plan. "And what about you? What will you do?" "I'll make sure you get there safely," Jackson replied without hesitation. "After that, I have my own business to take care of." Relira couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty at the thought of parting ways. She had only known this human for a short time, but he had already saved her life twice now. The galaxy was a dangerous place, especially for someone like her, and she wasn't sure how she'd manage without his help. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. Jackson gave her a curt nod, but said nothing more. He returned to cleaning his weapon, and Relira settled into her seat, her mind still spinning from the whirlwind of events that had led them here. As they neared the neutral spaceport, the vast station loomed into view, a sprawling structure of interconnected rings and docks, each one bustling with ships from across the galaxy. The port was a melting pot of species, a place where deals were made and old debts were settled. It was also one of the few places where even the syndicates had to tread carefully. Relira felt a surge of hope as they approached. Once they landed, she could finally begin to think about her future, about where she could go next, about what life might look like after this nightmare. But as the shuttle descended toward one of the docks, something caught her attention on the scanner. "Jackson," she said, her voice tense, "there's a ship following us." Jackson immediately moved to the console, his eyes narrowing as he took in the readings. "It's a syndicate scout. They must have tracked us here." Relira's heart sank. "What do we do?" Jackson's expression hardened, and he grabbed his helmet, slipping it back over his head. "We don't have much time. Once we land, they'll come after us. You need to stay close to me and keep your head down. If they catch us here, we're both dead." Relira swallowed hard, fear tightening in her chest, but she nodded. She had no choice but to trust him now. As the shuttle touched down on the station's landing pad, the heavy thrum of the engines powering down filled the air. Jackson moved quickly, grabbing a small satchel of supplies and strapping it across his chest. "Stay close," he repeated, his voice muffled slightly by the helmet. Relira followed him down the shuttle ramp, her eyes darting around the busy docking bay. Ships of all sizes were coming and going, and various species moved about in the chaotic swirl of activity. But her focus was on the ship that had landed a few pads away, the Syndicate Scout. She could see them, the same mercenaries that had hunted her before, disembarking from their ship with weapons drawn. Her pulse quickened, but Jackson's steady presence kept her grounded. They weaved through the crowd, moving quickly but not fast enough to draw attention. Rhalyra's heart pounded in her chest as they ducked into a narrow alley between two cargo bays. Jackson stopped, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. "We're going to have to lose them in the market," he said. "It's crowded, and they won't risk a shootout there." Rhalyra nodded, her throat dry with fear. She was about to respond when she felt a cold presence behind her. The air shifted, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. A syndicate mercenary had found them. Chapter 4. The Price of Honor. Rhalyra's body went cold as she sensed the mercenary before she even saw him. The low growl that reached her ears sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, and there he was, a towering syndicate mercenary, his reptilian eyes glowing with malice. His hulking frame blocked the only way out, claws flexing in anticipation as a cruel grin split his scaled face. "You really thought you could escape us?" His voice was a guttural hiss, dripping with amusement. "Foolish alien girl. You're worth a lot to the right buyers." Rhalyra took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced toward Jackson, hoping for some sign that he had a plan. The human stood between her and the mercenary, his posture as steady as ever, though the tension in his muscles betrayed his readiness for combat. His plasma blade hummed faintly in his hand, casting a pale glow that contrasted against the shadows of the station's underbelly. Jackson didn't speak, his eyes locked on the mercenary with cold intensity. The syndicate didn't seem fazed by the silent challenge. Instead, he chuckled, taking a menacing step forward. "You humans are all the same, thinking you're invincible, but I know you're kind. Soft on the inside, easy to break." Jackson's expression remained unreadable, but Rhalyra saw his grip tighten on the plasma blade. The air between them was thick with tension, the kind that came just before violence erupted. Without warning, the syndicate lunged, his massive claws swiping through the air with terrifying speed. Rhalyra gasped, but Jackson was faster. He sidestepped the attack with fluid precision, bringing his plasma blade up to slash at the mercenary's side. The blade seared into the syndicate's armored scales, sending sparks flying as it made contact. The mercenary roared in pain but didn't falter. He swung his other arm, and Jackson barely avoided the blow, ducking low to dodge the deadly claws. Despite the syndicate's size, he was surprisingly quick, and Rhalyra's heart raced as the two combatants clashed with brutal efficiency. Jackson was calculating in his movements, striking with precision rather than force. His plasma blade cut through the air, aiming for the weak points in the syndicate's armor. But the mercenary's thick scales protected him from serious damage, and each blow seemed to only enrage him further. The fight moved in a deadly dance, with Jackson narrowly avoiding each crushing blow. His agility was remarkable, but Rhalyra could see the strain starting to show. The syndicate was relentless, his strength overwhelming. With every strike Jackson dodged, it became clear that the fight was wearing him down. The mercenary let out a guttural laugh as he swung both arms in a wide arc, forcing Jackson to roll out of the way. "You're fast, human, but it won't be enough." Jackson didn't respond, his focus entirely on the fight. He darted forward again, landing a solid strike on the syndicate's leg, the plasma blade hissing as it sliced through the armored flesh. The mercenary howled, stumbling back, but he quickly regained his footing. With a roar of fury, the syndicate charged, his massive form barreling toward Jackson with frightening speed. Jackson tried to dodge, but the mercenary was ready this time. His claws raked across Jackson's chest, the force of the blow sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. "Jackson!" Rhalyra's cry echoed through the narrow corridor as she watched in horror. Jackson slumped to the ground, momentarily stunned. The syndicate loomed over him, raising his claws for a final strike. Rhalyra's pulse pounded in her ears, panic clawing at her chest. She had to do something, anything. Before she could think, her body moved on instinct. She grabbed a discarded metal rod from the floor and hurled it with all her strength. The makeshift weapon struck the syndicate on the side of his head, catching him off guard just long enough for Jackson to act. With a surge of effort, Jackson pushed himself off the ground, his plasma blade igniting once more. He lunged forward, driving the blade deep into the syndicate's exposed side. The mercenary let out a strangled roar as the blade pierced through his armor, his massive body convulsing as Jackson twisted the blade to ensure the lethal blow. The syndicate collapsed to the ground, his body twitching once before falling still. The fight was over. Breathing heavily, Jackson rose to his feet, his hand clutching his chest where the syndicate's claws had struck. Blood trickled from the wound, but he seemed unfazed, his focus already shifting back to Relira. "Are you hurt?" His voice was steady, though she could hear the strain in it. Relira shook her head, still trying to process what had just happened. "No, I'm fine." Her voice was shaky, her body trembling with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. "Good. We need to move. More of them will be coming." He didn't wait for her response, already heading toward the end of the corridor, his steps quick and purposeful despite his injuries. Relira followed him, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the fight. The syndicate had been moments away from killing them both, but Jackson had saved her again. The image of him standing between her and danger, risking his life to protect hers, stirred something deep within her. As they reached a quieter part of the station, Jackson paused to catch his breath, leaning against the wall. He removed his helmet, revealing his rugged, battle-worn face. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Thank you," Relira said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't just thanking him for saving her life, there was something more to it. In that moment, she realized that Jackson wasn't the cold, ruthless killer she had been told humans were. He was a protector, someone who fought not out of bloodlust but out of duty. Jackson glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You don't owe me thanks. Just staying alive long enough to get you out of here." Relira hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had always thought of humans as dangerous, unpredictable beings, creatures driven by violence and instinct. But Jackson defied that image. He had risked everything to keep her safe, even when he had no reason to. She had misjudged him, and perhaps misjudged his entire species. "I thought humans were different," she said carefully, not wanting to offend him. "I've heard so many stories about how your kind is bloodthirsty, how you dash." "Stories aren't always true," Jackson interrupted, his tone even. He met her gaze, his eyes hard but not unkind. "We're not all the same. Some of us fight because we have to. Others fight because there's no other choice." Relira felt a pang of guilt at her own assumptions. She had spent so long fearing humans, believing they were monsters, but now she saw that they were just as complex as any other species. Jackson wasn't a monster. He was a man who had seen too much, fought too many battles, and yet still chose to protect those who needed it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly, her voice full of curiosity. Jackson was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Relira didn't press further, sensing that there was a deeper pain behind his answer, something he wasn't ready to share. "We need to keep moving," Jackson said, pushing off the wall and motioning for her to follow. "The syndicates won't stop. Not until we're far from this station." Relira nodded and followed him without hesitation. As they navigated the winding corridors of the station, heading for the exit that would lead them to safety, she found herself thinking about everything that had happened. In the end, it wasn't the stories that mattered, was the people. And Jackson, despite all the violence he had endured, had shown her that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was still honor, and perhaps even hope.